I never thought moving out to the countryside would turn my life into a circus, but that's exactly what happened the day I had the misfortune of living near a woman like Karen, the self-proclaimed HOA queen. To give you some background, I bought my land fair and square, a sprawling 200-acre property in rural America, filled with rolling green pastures, a few thick groves of trees, and a creek that shimmered under the sunlight. I had spent years saving up for it, working 2 jobs, sweating through the worst days of my life so I could finally own a place where no one would bother me. No city noise, no crowded neighbors, no one dictating what color I should paint my porch or when I could mow my lawn. Just peace, quiet, and the freedom of the open land. But as fate would have it, my land bordered a gated community run by an HOA, and inside that fortress of absurd rules lived the tyrant herself, Karen. If you've never had the displeasure of meeting a Karen before, let me paint you the picture. Short blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, a perpetual scowl plastered on her face, and an ego larger than my entire pasture. She strutted around like she owned not just the HOA, but the entire county. She believed her word was law, and unfortunately, many of the residents under her thumb were too timid to challenge her. At first, I kept my distance. I wasn't part of her HOA, and my land wasn't subject to their ridiculous regulations. I figured she would have no power over me, so I focused on building up my homestead. I put up a barn, fenced off a large section of pasture for my bulls, and even started fixing up an old farmhouse that had been sitting abandoned for years. My bulls, by the way, weren't just livestock, they were my pride and joy. Massive, muscular creatures, weighing nearly a ton each, with horns like sharpened lances and the kind of power that could make even the bravest man step back. I raised them from calves, cared for them, trained them to respect me but fearlessly defend their territory. To me, they were part of the family, and to anyone foolish enough to trespass, they were a warning written in flesh and muscle. Things were fine for the first few months, but then Karen set her sights on me. It started small, passive-aggressive comments when she accidentally stopped by my property line, muttering about how my farm aesthetic was ruining the view for her community. Then came the letters. Pages of HOA nonsense demanding I comply with neighborhood standards, even though I wasn't part of their neighborhood. I ignored them, and that only made her angrier. Soon, she began spreading rumors around town, whispering that my bulls were dangerous, that I was some sort of recluse with a violent streak, that my land was unsafe for children. I brushed it off, knowing that anyone with half a brain could see through her lies. But Karen wasn't satisfied with gossip. No, she wanted control. And to get it, she was willing to pull one of the boldest, most infuriating stunts I had ever seen in my life. It happened on a Friday evening in late summer, when the air was thick with the smell of cut hay and the sound of cicadas buzzing in the trees. I was sitting on my porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink, when I noticed a strange stream of cars rolling past the HOA gates and onto the road that cut alongside my property. At first, I thought it was some kind of neighborhood event, maybe a barbecue or one of those block parties suburban folk seem to love. But as car after car after car poured in, I realized something wasn't right. Soon, pickup trucks loaded with camping gear, SUVs dragging trailers, and even a few buses full of people began turning directly onto my land, without permission. My jaw nearly hit the floor. They weren't just passing by. They were setting up camp. I stormed down to my fence line, shouting at the trespassers to get the hell off my property. But instead of listening, they waved at me like I was some kind of park ranger overseeing their weekend retreat. Tents were going up, bonfires being built, coolers dragged out, and kids running wild across my pastures. And who was standing there in the middle of it all, megaphone in hand, directing the chaos like she was organizing a music festival? You guessed it, Karen. She had apparently told everyone in her precious HOA that my land was community property, and that I had graciously allowed them to use it for a massive weekend camping event. I could hardly believe the gall. She didn't ask me, didn't tell me, didn't even leave me a note. She just decided, in that entitled brain of hers, that my private land was her playground. Within an hour, there were close to 1,000 people trampling my fields. They parked their cars in long rows, smashing down the tall grass I had been growing for feed. They hauled out barbecues and generators, blaring music so loud it rattled the windows of my farmhouse. Children screamed and splashed in my creek, muddying up the water, while adults cracked open beers and acted like they were at some kind of county fair. My blood boiled hotter with every passing second. I tried yelling, tried reasoning, but all I got in return was Karen's smug voice echoing through her megaphone, "Don't mind him, everyone. He's just the caretaker. He's fine with it." Caretaker? Fine with it? The audacity made my vision blur with rage. I called the sheriff, but when he arrived, he seemed hesitant. "It's a civil matter," he told me, shrugging as if 1,000 trespassers destroying my land was no big deal. "Take it up in court." By the time I could even think about filing a lawsuit, my property would be trashed beyond recognition. I needed a solution, and fast. That's when my eyes wandered toward the pasture where my bulls stood, massive silhouettes against the fading sunlight. They snorted and pawed at the dirt, clearly agitated by the sudden influx of noise and strangers so close to their territory. A wicked thought crept into my mind, one that made me smile despite my fury. Karen wanted a camping trip. She wanted to treat my land like some kind of amusement park. Fine. I'd give her guests an experience they'd never forget. So I walked calmly into the barn, grabbed the gate keys, and headed straight for the bull pasture. I can still remember the weight of the gate keys in my hand that night, how the cool metal seemed to thrum with possibility. My bulls had been restless all evening, pacing along the fence line, tossing their heads, and snorting at the scent of unfamiliar bodies nearby. These weren't docile milk cows. These were Spanish-blooded, thick-shouldered beasts bred for raw muscle and raw attitude. I had raised them from calves, trained them with discipline and respect, but I also knew their instinct. They did not take kindly to intruders. Every stomp of their hooves, every flare of their nostrils was a warning sign, and the fools camped in my pastures were too blind or too arrogant to notice. As I slipped the first lock off the main gate, I thought about every insult, every letter, every smug smirk Karen had sent my way since I moved here. I thought about her parading around with her megaphone, twisting her lies into reality as if my property were nothing more than her personal event space. My blood boiled, and with it, a calm sort of determination settled over me. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice, country style. The bulls shuffled forward as the hinges creaked, their hulking frames eager to be free. I whistled low, a command they knew well, and the largest of them, a black brute I named Thor, raised his head toward me. He was a mountain of muscle, nearly 2,200 pounds, his curved horns gleaming in the firelight from the campers' bonfires. Behind him stood Zeus and Hercules, equally massive, equally furious. These weren't animals anyone could mistake for friendly pasture pets, they were storms on four legs. And they were about to crash straight into the circus Karen had unleashed on my land. I swung the gate wide, gave a sharp clap, and stepped back as the herd thundered out into the night. The sound alone was enough to raise goosebumps on my arms, the deep, rhythmic pounding of a dozen bulls charging across the earth, snorts exploding from their nostrils like war drums. The ground trembled beneath their weight, and dust billowed up around them, swirling in the glow of fire pits and headlights. It didn't take long for the campers to notice. At first, a few kids pointed and laughed, thinking it was some kind of attraction, part of the camping event Karen had promised them. But when Thor bellowed, a deep, resonant roar that shook the air like thunder, panic spread faster than wildfire. Screams pierced the night. Tents collapsed as people scrambled out, tripping over ropes and stakes. Beer cans flew, coolers toppled, and in the chaos, more than a few grown men bolted faster than the children. Karen's shrill voice blasted through her megaphone, "Stay calm, everyone. They're just cows. Don't run." But her words were drowned out by the chorus of terror as my bulls charged into the camp. Thor swung his massive head and sent a picnic table splintering into pieces. Zeus plowed straight through a row of lawn chairs, scattering them like matchsticks. Hercules reared up and came down hard on a fire pit, sending sparks shooting into the night sky. People ran in every direction, shrieking, dropping their gear, leaving behind shoes, bags, and even entire tents as they fled. The once festive atmosphere turned into a stampede of screaming humans trying desperately to outrun a herd they had no business provoking. From my porch, I watched it unfold like a scene from an old western. The land that had been crawling with trespassers just minutes before now looked like a battlefield. Cars tried to peel out of the fields, tires spinning in the soft earth, some of them colliding as drivers panicked. One bus, packed with screaming teenagers, got stuck in the mud, rocking violently as the driver gunned the engine to no avail. People were pounding on the windows, waving flashlights like distress signals. All the while, Karen stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, megaphone limp in her hand, her wide eyes reflecting the fires and headlights as she finally realized what she had unleashed. I almost felt sorry for her, almost. She had marched onto my land with arrogance and entitlement, thinking she could rewrite the rules of ownership by sheer willpower. But now, faced with the raw, undeniable force of nature she had trespassed against, she was powerless. The bulls didn't care about HOA bylaws or her megaphone commands. To them, this was their pasture, their territory, and the invaders were nothing more than trespassers to be driven out. And driven out they were. In less than an hour, what had begun as a 1,000-person campout dissolved into a ghost town of shredded tents, smoldering fires, abandoned coolers, and tire tracks tearing scars into my fields. By the time I herded the bulls back into their pasture, calmly, firmly, like a shepherd guiding warriors back from battle, the place was deserted. Only a handful of cars remained, stuck and abandoned in the mud, their owners too terrified to return for them. Beer cans littered the grass, food was scattered everywhere, and the creek was churned up from the stampede of panicked swimmers. My land looked like a war zone, but the silence that followed was sweeter than any peace I had known since moving here. I locked the gate, gave Thor a proud pat on his broad flank, and whispered a thank you to my herd. They had done what the sheriff wouldn't, what the courts would take months to settle. They had enforced the one law that mattered out here, respect for private property. Karen, of course, wasn't gone for long. By Saturday morning, she was back, storming down my driveway in her Lexus SUV, sunglasses hiding her puffy, sleepless eyes. She marched up to my porch, red-faced and furious, shouting about lawsuits, reckless endangerment, and animal cruelty. She claimed people had been nearly trampled to death, that I had terrorized innocent families, and that the HOA would make sure I paid dearly. I let her rant, sipping my coffee, letting her words scatter uselessly into the morning air. Finally, when she paused to catch her breath, I leaned forward and said in the calmest voice I could muster, "Karen, those bulls were on my land. The people who ran screaming. Also on my land. You brought them here. You lied to them. And they got exactly what they deserved for trespassing. Now, unless you want the sheriff to see the video footage I took last night, I suggest you leave before my bulls decide they're not done yet." Her jaw dropped, the color draining from her face. She hadn't realized I'd set up cameras all around my property, security I'd installed months ago after her first attempts to harass me. The footage clearly showed her directing the crowd, declaring my land community property, and leading the mob onto my fields. If she wanted to take me to court, she'd be walking straight into a countersuit that would tear her reputation to shreds. For the first time since I'd met her, Karen didn't have a comeback. She turned on her heel, stormed back to her SUV, and sped off, gravel spitting from her tires. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd learned her lesson. But I underestimated Karen's ego. And I had no idea that unleashing the bulls was only the beginning of the war between us. The next few weeks were quiet on the surface, but underneath, I could feel the storm brewing. The HOA wasn't just some small committee of nosy neighbors anymore, it was Karen's weapon, her army, and she was sharpening it for another strike. At first, I noticed the whispers around town. At the feed store, I caught folks glancing at me, shaking their heads as they muttered about how I had let wild bulls loose on families. At the diner, I overheard a couple of HOA members telling the waitress that I was dangerous, a menace, someone who should be removed before he hurt someone. Karen's lies were spreading like wildfire, and though the people who actually lived outside the HOA knew better, the ones inside her gilded walls swallowed every word she fed them. It wasn't enough that she had trespassed and been humiliated. No, she wanted revenge, and she wanted to paint me as the villain to get it. Her first official strike came in the form of letters. Certified mail, sealed with the HOA's pompous little logo, stuffed into my box by the dozen. Each one was filled with legal jargon, accusations, and demands. They accused me of endangering the welfare of the community, of unlawful use of livestock, of creating hazardous conditions for families. They even threatened to fine me, fines, as if their jurisdiction reached across the fence into land they had no authority over. I laughed at the absurdity of it, but I kept every letter, every empty threat, stacking them neatly in a folder like ammunition for the battles to come. What Karen didn't know was that I had a cousin in the city, an attorney with a sharp mind and even sharper teeth. I mailed him copies of everything, and his response was simple: let her keep digging her hole. When it's deep enough, we'll bury her in it. But Karen wasn't content to fight with paper. No, she wanted to break me in spirit and in reputation. That's when the sabotage began. One morning I woke to find my mailbox smashed, wood splintered, and metal bent like a soda can. Another day, someone spray-painted the word "killer" across my barn doors in sloppy red letters. Trash bags full of rotting garbage appeared tossed over my fence, bursting open in the grass. Once, when I drove into town, I noticed a group of teenagers, HOA brats, no doubt, mocking me, making bullhorns with their fingers and charging at each other in the parking lot, laughing about the psycho cowboy who sicked his monsters on kids. Each incident chipped away at my patience, but instead of lashing out, I documented everything. Photos, videos, timestamps. I wasn't just fighting Karen anymore, I was building a case brick by brick. Then came the boldest move yet. One Saturday afternoon, as I was working on repairing my creek fence, I noticed a convoy of HOA trucks pulling up along my property line. Out climbed Karen and half a dozen of her cronies, each one holding clipboards and wearing smug little smiles. They marched right up to my fence as though they were conducting an inspection. Karen, with her ever-present sunglasses and her sharp, nasal voice, shouted across the field, "We've voted, and this property is officially condemned for public safety. You'll need to remove those bulls immediately and vacate these premises until further notice." My hands tightened on the hammer I was holding. Condemned? Remove my bulls? Vacate my own land? The sheer arrogance of it made me want to laugh and roar at the same time. I set the hammer down slowly, walked toward the fence, and fixed her with a stare that made even her lackeys shuffle nervously. "Karen," I said, my voice low and steady, "you and your clipboard club don't own this land. You never will. Step 1 foot past that fence, and I'll have the sheriff down here so fast your head will spin. And when he sees the stack of evidence I've got against you, he'll be hauling you off, not me." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see the fury bubbling beneath her fake composure. She muttered something about me being finished and stormed back to her SUV, her minions trailing behind her like frightened ducks. But I knew she wasn't finished. Karen was the kind of woman who, when beaten, didn't retreat, she doubled down. Sure enough, 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of engines revving on my land. I grabbed my shotgun and flashlight, storming outside to see what was going on. To my disbelief, there were half a dozen trucks tearing up my fields, spinning donuts in the soft soil, headlights blinding as they hooped and hollered out the windows. The bastards were trying to destroy my pasture, ruin the land I worked so hard to maintain. I fired a warning shot into the air, the sound echoing like thunder across the night. Tires screeched, engines roared, and the trucks sped off into the darkness. When I inspected the damage the next morning, my heart sank at the deep ruts gouged into the earth, the broken fence posts, the crushed grass. But once again, I didn't rage. I didn't retaliate blindly. I installed more cameras, upgraded my floodlights, and reinforced my fences with steel. If they wanted war, I would fight it smart. The sheriff finally came around again after the truck incident, more concerned this time, especially when I showed him the footage of Karen's little convoy with their clipboards and the trucks tearing up my property. He frowned, shook his head, and told me to stay calm while he looked into it. I could tell he was under pressure, maybe from the county, maybe from the HOA, but at least now he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. Still, the system moved slow, and Karen knew how to use that to her advantage. She was counting on me losing my temper, doing something reckless she could twist into a weapon against me. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. No, I was going to wait until she overplayed her hand. And overplay it, she did. Because as bold as her camping stunt had been, what she tried next would make that look like child's play. Karen wasn't just content with smearing my name or sabotaging my land anymore. No, this time she was going to trespass again, only this time, she wouldn't stop at 1,000 campers. She wanted to turn my land into the centerpiece of her empire, and she was willing to risk everything to do it. I should have known Karen wasn't going to back off after the bull incident, but even I wasn't prepared for the scale of her next stunt. It began with whispers again, little hints I caught at the diner and in town. Folks mentioned that the HOA was planning something big, some kind of community festival, though no one could quite explain what it was or where it would be held. I didn't pay much mind at first, assuming it was another one of their tacky neighborhood carnivals with overpriced lemonade and rigged raffle tickets. But then I saw the flyers. They were plastered on telephone poles, pinned up on bulletin boards at the feed store, even tucked under the windshield wipers of cars parked outside the post office. The words nearly made my blood run cold: HOA Family Festival and Camping Weekend, hosted on the open community grounds. And the picture beneath? A wide, sweeping photo of my land, my pastures, my creek, stolen right off the internet from the real estate listing before I bought it. The audacity nearly knocked me off my feet. Not only had Karen decided to organize another invasion, she was advertising it publicly, dragging in not just her HOA cronies but anyone in the county foolish enough to believe her lies. The open community grounds. That was my land. There was nothing open about it. It wasn't public property, it wasn't for lease, and it damn sure wasn't for the HOA to claim. My phone buzzed non-stop for days with people asking if I was really hosting a festival, and each time I had to grit my teeth and explain the truth. But the machine Karen had built was powerful, and once her flyers were circulating, the lie took root. By the time the so-called festival weekend rolled around, I could hear the roar of traffic from miles away. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching in disbelief as a steady stream of vehicles poured down the road, far more than the first camping stunt. RVs the size of houses, buses painted with school logos, caravans of minivans and SUVs stretched as far as the eye could see. They weren't trickling in this time, they were arriving in waves, thousands of them, like some biblical exodus. Karen had outdone herself. This wasn't a campout. This was an invasion. And once again, they poured straight past the HOA gates and onto my property, setting up tents, unloading grills, dragging out kegs, and planting banners that read, "Welcome to the HOA Family Festival." I dialed the sheriff before the first 100 people had even finished unloading, but his line was jammed. When I finally got through, he sighed heavily and said he was dispatching units to handle traffic control. Traffic control. Not trespassing, not invasion, not theft of property, traffic control. It was clear as day, Karen had greased the right palms, made the right calls, and now the county was treating her insanity like a legitimate event. My jaw tightened so hard it ached. They weren't going to stop her. If I wanted this madness off my land, would have to stop her myself. I spent the afternoon pacing the edge of my porch, bulls restless in their pasture behind me. Thor pawed at the ground, tossing his massive head, his dark eyes fixed on the growing chaos in my fields. I knew he could sense it, the trespassers, the invasion, the disrespect. I kept thinking about what had happened the last time, how quickly the herd had scattered 1,000 campers, how effective they had been at defending what was theirs. But this time was different. This wasn't just 1,000 uninvited guests. This was closer to 3,000 or 4,000, spread out across every corner of my land. Families roasting hot dogs, teenagers blasting music, kids stomping through the creek. They weren't just camping, they were treating my home like a county fairground. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the trampled grass, and that's when I saw Karen herself, standing proudly on a makeshift stage in the center of it all. She wore a bright red blazer, oversized sunglasses, and held a microphone in her manicured hand as though she were a politician addressing her loyal subjects. "Welcome, everyone," she shouted, her voice booming over the loudspeakers they had set up without my consent. "This is the first annual HOA Family Festival, and thanks to our generous community caretaker, we have all this beautiful land to enjoy together." The crowd erupted into cheers. My fists clenched so tight my knuckles popped. Caretaker. She was still peddling that same lie, painting me as some sort of hired groundskeeper while she stole my property right out from under me. I felt the anger rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Rage wouldn't win this battle. Strategy would. I walked back into my farmhouse, opened the gun safe, and pulled out my drone, something I had bought a few years back for surveying my property. If the sheriff and the county wouldn't act, then I needed undeniable proof of this trespass, something even a crooked system couldn't ignore. I launched the drone into the evening sky, its quiet hum blending with the din of the festival below. From the monitor, I watched as the camera soared over the fields, capturing shot after shot of the sprawling chaos, rows of tents, bonfires blazing, trucks parked on my hayfields, kids splashing in my creek, and Karen standing center stage like the queen of a stolen kingdom. Every second of it was recorded, time-stamped, and stored. Evidence. Ironclad, indisputable evidence. But as I piloted the drone, my mind kept wandering back to the bulls. They were restless, pacing and snorting, watching the lights and hearing the noise from their pasture. I knew their power, their ability to scatter a mob in seconds. But I also knew the risk. Thousands of people weren't the same as 1,000. This crowd was denser, more unpredictable. A stampede here could turn deadly in an instant, and as much as I despised Karen, I didn't want innocent kids or bystanders to pay the price for her arrogance. So I hatched another plan, a way to end this invasion without risking unnecessary bloodshed, but still delivering a lesson Karen and her army would never forget. I spent the night preparing. I rigged floodlights along the barn, loaded my truck with supplies, and set traps around the creek where campers had been carelessly stomping through. I reinforced the gates of the bull pasture, knowing I might need to let the herd out again, but determined to use them only as the final hammer blow. As the hours passed and the festival raged into the night with fireworks, loud music, and drunken shouting, I waited in the shadows, patient as a wolf. Karen thought she had claimed my land, but she was about to learn that every inch of it answered only to me. And when dawn broke, her festival would collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. When dawn finally peeled itself over the horizon, the festival still roared like an engine that refused to idle. I watched from the tree lean as the last of the drunken campers staggered about, trying to make sense of the mess they had made of my land. Tents sagged like defeated soldiers, grills were overturned, and the creek that had been the sparkling centerpiece of the night was muddied and strewn with plastic cups and half-eaten food. Karen stood at the front of the remains, her red blazer stained with ash and dirt, her sunglasses knocked crooked as if her crown had slipped. She looked smaller in the gray light, and for a moment I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected, pity, maybe, or the tired mercy you feel for someone whose vanity costs them everything. But that feeling passed as quickly as it came. She had dragged thousands onto my land. She had broken the first rule of living here: you respect the boundaries or you pay the price. I had spent the night waiting and watching, and I knew the time to act had come. I walked out from the trees with my hands empty and my gait calm, because that was always the most disarming thing: composure. People noticed me then, some with startled looks that shifted to something nastier when they remembered the stories Karen had spread. "There he is," someone muttered. Karen's head snapped up. She glared at me with all the fury of a woman whose illusions had been punctured. "What are you doing out here?" "Get off my stage," she screamed, voice cracking like a rope. I kept walking, keeping my eyes level with hers, letting the drone footage flood into my mind, the evidence that would make sure this farce ended not in chatter but in concrete consequences. "You brought them here," I said, my voice steady. "You told them this land belonged to your HOA. You told them I was the caretaker who welcomed them. You lied." Her face flushed like a stopped clock, and she opened her mouth, then closed it like a trap. Around us, the crowd began to murmur, the earlier bravado dissolving into awkward silence as the truth seeded itself into the morning air. I could see the gears turning in the heads of those who'd come. Some were ashamed, some angry at being duped, and some still too defensive to admit they'd been wrong. The sheriff's deputies were still hours away, the county dragged into paperwork and politics while the mess they had refused to immediately treat sat in the sun. That meant I had to finish this on the ground, in a way that left no question of who had done the right thing. I didn't scream or call in the bulls. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the little remote that controlled the floodlights and speakers I'd rigged around the perimeter. The audience didn't know why I had them, but they would. I hit a button and the barn lights flared on, bright and clinical, washing the festival in harsh white. Then I switched the speakers to the drone's feed. Karen heard the hum of recorded voices and turned, bewildered, as the monitor on a makeshift tripod flickered to life showing the overhead footage from the night before, timestamps clear as day, Karen on the stage, the swelling crowd, trucks rolling across my fields, people wading into my creek. The footage played in slow, undeniable loops. The murmurs around us rose and then fell away into stunned silence. People started to file away from the damaged fields, some sheepish, some angry at being lied to, others just quiet and embarrassed. A few fed-up parents pulled their kids away, muttering apologies under their breath. Karen's face, once flushed with triumph, turned a corpse white as she realized the magnitude of what was being laid at her feet. She tried to speak, "You can't show that, that's private." But the crowd no longer moved with her, and her words slid off like water off oil. My phone buzzed with calls from people I didn't even know, all of them pointing to the same thing: the footage. I had spent the night not just recording, but labeling and backing up every clip to multiple drives. I had posted a copy to the county complaint portal and sent sealed copies to my cousin lawyer with a curt note: "Let's proceed." When the sheriff's deputies finally pulled onto the lane, their demeanor had changed. There was no more talk of civil matter. There was a notebook and a seriousness in the way they moved. I showed them the footage on my tablet, and watched as their faces grew heavy with the kind of professional anger that meant someone else's negligence had turned into a public problem. They started taking statements, mine, a few of the shaken campers who admitted they'd been told the land was community property, even one of Karen's HOA board members who'd had a last-minute moral crisis and agreed to talk. The deputies radioed in for backup. Someone called the county inspectors to look at the damage and the permits, or lack thereof, that had been claimed. Within hours, the situation mechanically transformed from a raucous festival to an investigation. Karen tried to scramble, to spin the narrative. She accused me of terrorizing families again, her voice high and shrill, but the video was a slow, patient rebuttal to every accusation. The sheriff asked her to step aside for questioning, and in a spiral of fury and desperation she did what she always did when words failed: she blamed everyone else and tried to make it someone else's fault. It didn't work. Evidence isn't swayed by invective. She was looking at civil and criminal exposure, trespassing, incitement, willful endangerment by dragging people into an unpermitted, unmanaged event on private property. The county would have to sort out the cup of spilled paint on their own. I had given them the palette they needed. The legal process moved with the steadiness of a glacier, slow, inevitable, and ultimately reshaping the landscape. Karen's HOA could not simply sweep the incident under a rug. The county inspectors found multiple code violations in their makeshift camping infrastructure, and the insurance companies started sniffing around. Lawsuits were filed on both sides, mine to reclaim damages and punitive recompense for trespass and property destruction. There's a ridiculous, toothless attempt to pin reckless endangerment on me. The media, hungry for the story of the entitled HOA queen and the rancher who had drawn a line in the dirt, showed up too. There were interviews, blurred faces for privacy, and my cousin lawyer advised me to keep my head down in public while we let the legal engine run. He called it strategic restraint. I called it patience. Amid the paperwork and court dates and depositions, life on the ranch returned to its rough, honest rhythm. The bulls grazed back into their pasture, fat and unbothered, occasionally lifting their heads to watch me with the calm regard of beasts who understand mortality but have no use for spectacle. I repaired fence posts and sown seed where tires had churned the soil to mud. I planted wildflowers along the creek bank to coax it back to health. People in town waved at me differently now, some with gratitude for what I'd protected, others with the wary glances of those who have seen conflict and prefer to keep their distance. The sheriff stopped by sometimes with coffee and updates, not because he enjoyed my company but because he respected the chain of events. The legal case, when it settled, did more than punish Karen, it sent a message about property and accountability. She was fined heavily, faced probation, and the HOA's leadership was stripped from her hands after a messy recall election. She moved away a year later under the weight of public scorn and financial penalties, a faded blip in town memory. But the victory was quieter than I expected. It didn't feel triumphant in a crowing, chest-puffing way. It felt like clearing the barn after a storm, tiring, necessary, and a little bittersweet. I defended my land. I defended the rules that keep a small community from descending into chaos. Yet the aftermath left scars you couldn't see, the damage to the creek that took months to heal, the way I sometimes woke at night with the echo of screams still ringing in my ears, the subtle shift in neighbors' conversations when my name came up. I thought, for a while, I might move. But this land was mine, and every scar was, in a way, a part of the story I'd chosen. It had cost me time, sleep, and a few friendships, but it had also taught me something that city folks could never understand: ownership is not just a piece of paper. It's a promise you keep with your hands, your animals, and the land itself. In the slow seasons that followed, I found small ways to restore more than the land. I started a community program, on my terms, to teach kids about livestock and land stewardship. It was healing in both directions. Parents who had been at the festival sent their kids, eager to mend fences in more ways than one. They learned to move cattle, mend fences, and respect boundaries. The irony was not lost on me. I was teaching the very people who had once trampled my fields how to care for them. Some of Karen's former neighbors came too, embarrassed but sincere, and over time the barbs dulled into polite conversation. The community rebuilt parts of the creek bank voluntarily, bringing tools and elbow grease. It wasn't redemption for the lies, but it was a start toward mutual respect. As for me, I kept the drone footage locked away as insurance, but I rarely watched it. I didn't need to. The land, my land, spoke in grasses and fences, in the contented lowing of bulls at dusk and the quiet rush of clean water in the creek. Once, on a warm afternoon as I sat on the porch with a glass of tea, Thor ambled up and nudged my knee with an enormous, mellow head. I laughed and scratched behind his ear. He snorted, turned, and wandered back toward the pasture, all dignity and muscle. It was a simple moment, a reminder of why I'd come here in the first place: the open sky, the honest labor, and the deep, unassuming peace of a place that answers to no one but the person who tends it. People still tell the story in town, the rancher who let his bulls loose on the HOA's festival, and the telling changes with each retelling. Some call it justice. Some call it madness. I don't mind how they tell it, because the truth is what it has always been: a man protecting what's his, choosing force only when everything else failed, and learning along the way that power without patience is hollow. Karen's arrogance lit a fuse that threatened something dear to me, and I did what I had to do. The lesson that stuck, though, was quieter. Guard your property, yes, but guard your soul too. Don't let revenge eat you. Let justice, slow and deliberate, do the heavy lifting. When autumn came and the first frosts creased the tall grasses, I walked the fence line and looked out over the fields. The moon rose like a watchful eye, and far off in the distance the lights of the town twinkled. I breathed in cold, clear air and felt something like closure settle over me. The land beneath my boots was still mine, scarred but stubborn, and alongside the scars there were small stitches of repair, new fences, young saplings planted along the creek, the slow green of regrowth. Thor and the herd grazed quietly, oblivious to the human stories we weave about them. I tipped my hat to the horizon, said a small, private thanks to the animals who had defended us, and turned back to the farmhouse to stoke the stove for the night. Life, stubborn and ordinary, went on.